This is Andy Hargreaves. Andy is a research professor in the Lynch School of Education at Boston College, past president of the International Congress of School Effectiveness and Improvement, recent advisor in education to the Premier of Ontario and currently to the First Minister of Scotland, and he's the founder of the Atlantic Rim Collaboratory, which he may talk about soon. His new book, Moving, a memoir, draws upon his own experience of social mobility in order to suggest more general possibilities for what social mobility might look like in the future. In his recent article for the Times Educational Supplement, Andy wrote that in the continuous whitewater world we're all navigating at the moment, it's just not possible to see everything ourselves all at once, especially what's ahead. And part of the reason I think we've gathered here today is to help one another to see more clearly how our education systems can adapt. He advocated in this article making COVID-19 an opportunity for learning, not just an interruption to it, making sure that we're all inclusive in who we communicate with, and giving teachers the power to do what they do best, which is to be the heroes that their students need. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Andy and take it away.
Thank you so much, Ruby. I just want to check. First of all, could you wave if you can hear me? Excellent, that's good. So welcome from Ottawa, where in Canada, the capital of Canada, where rain is indeed falling outside at the moment with a gloomy sky, but I can also see that the birds are gathering around the bird feeder because it's the one place they feel that reliable food is available for them. So I understand the opportunities as well as the problems of almost any situation we find ourselves in. I want to congratulate Ruby and all her team at the University of Warwick, where I spent a brief part of my career actually in the 1980s, a long time ago, for thinking of this conference, seeing a need for it, and bringing together people in the field. And I think that that's important evidence of how many people have been stepping forward during this crisis and taking leadership rather than waiting for leadership to be given to them. And I think it's also important because there are a lot of these discussions going on at the moment. Many of them are being convened by big organizations, by the United Nations, by the World Bank, by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, by technology companies, digital networks. So there are many of these meetings. I'm in about at least 2 or 3 of these each week. And they're useful and they're valuable, but they tend to have a kind of narrative to them, which I'll come on to later on. And that narrative is a lot about the importance of technology, and technology as the driver, and hybrid learning as what's on the other side of coronavirus. But there are lots of other things that are important to think about as well, which are the lives, the identities, the well-being of children, and indeed the lives and the identities and the well-being of the teachers of those children who are profoundly missing face-to-face emotional contact with the people that they're responsible for. Indeed, the very work that brought them into the profession in the first place. People mainly don't go into teaching to want to spend the rest of their careers online. Everybody's making the best of it at the moment. But there is a profound hole that is there in the lives of teachers and in the lives of our students right now. And it's probably going to take people in the profession, families, communities, psychologists, all the kinds of people participating in this conference to generate those kinds of things and those kinds of issues as well. So this morning I'm going to talk for a little under half an hour, and then there'll be time for open discussion, which I'm happy to have with anyone. And you're welcome to post anything you hear me say on Twitter, which is down on the bottom left at Hargreaves BC. You can try and get me up from 39,000 followers to 40,000 followers by tweeting in an ADHD kind of way. And you can also look up my website if you want to look for further materials. What I want to do today, really, with you, is to look at this question. This is, I hike a lot. I hike a lot in the UK. This is on the border of England and Wales, actually, last summer. And here we are in a dark, thorny tunnel, and there is light of it. We often use the phrase, is there light at the end of the tunnel? And then ironically, we say, well, yes, there is, but perhaps it's a train coming in the other direction. The question really, though, is once we come out of this tunnel, which way will we go? Getting to the light is one thing, but then choosing a direction and a path is a whole other question altogether. And this photo also comes from the Welsh-English border on Offa's Dyke. And it's a real sign, and it seems to symbolize where we are now. On the one hand, when we come out of this, do we go back to or continue on with what's felt like to some people like the end of the world at the moment in terms of what their work is about, what their relationships with children are like, what the experiences for particularly vulnerable children in families have often been now? Or instead of this pandemic crisis, can we, beyond it, think of some panoramic, broad, inclusive vision that will benefit everyone within our schools and communities, and also in the teaching profession, the very people who come into this work in order to help children, support them, develop them, and help the most vulnerable. The issue, first of all, is a question of leadership. It's a question of leadership at every level. And one thing we've noticed during the coronavirus pandemic is how countries have responded differently, not just to the health issues of the overall pandemic, but also to the educational issues that affect our children. What will online learning look like? What kinds of support will there be? What will back to school arrangements look like? How will we organize these? Who do we consult with when we make these decisions? And I think around the world, we're seeing two kinds of leadership. We're seeing one kind of leadership that is narcissistic, self-absorbed, worried about the politics, about the image. It's mainly about the leaders rather than about the led. And I've no idea why this picture appears here, but it just clearly seems to have dropped in at random in relation to the point that I'm making. And this is the spaceship, by the way, which is sending all these kinds of leaders down to them. And if we want to do something about it, we should deal with the aliens who keep sending us these kinds of leaders. What we know, though, is that this is not just a result of the quirks of particular leadership personalities, but as we see from Wilkinson and Pickett's terrific book and sequel on the spirit level and the inner level, they are epidemiologists, and they say that health and social problems in societies actually most correlate with the levels of income inequality within those societies. So the more unequal your society becomes, the greater your health and social problems are. The USA is the black hole performer, I think, up in the top right-hand corner, but the UK is not far behind. So when we get leadership that is indecisive, that is self-absorbed, that is divisive, that is not empathetic, and that is not inclusive, it's not just a reflection of the characteristics of those leaders, but it's a reflection of the kind of societies that we are in and the ethic that guides them. But this isn't the only kind of leadership that we can have or that is important. And as we come out of the coronavirus crisis, we can, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, think that austerity is inevitable, and the main thing is to get the economy going and to be able to build gross domestic product again and pay off the debt. And that is one kind of approach that countries are taking. I'll come back to it. But there's a group of leading economists, many of them women, actually, Mariana Mazzucato, Kate Rayworth, both prize winners in terms of the impact of the economic work, who were really promoting a different idea and saying that as important as gross domestic product and getting the economy going is the issue of quality of life. And we have a number of world leaders who have actually lined up behind this philosophy. Nicola Sturgeon of Scotland, who I am an advisor for in education, talks about how quality of life is as important as gross domestic product. If we think of this in educational terms, we'd say that the well-being of a child or a school or a country is as important as the test performance of and the level of the test performance of a child, a school, or a country. And Nicola Sturgeon's not alone. There are many other leaders, again, most of them women, who are networked with each other. They include Katrin Jakobsdottir from Iceland. They include Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand. And leaders of Denmark and Canada, Justin Trudeau there from Canada, who are lining up behind them. So what I'm trying to say is, as we move forward in this crisis and in general, some people are very and indeed exclusively economically driven, and that's why they want to get everybody back into school. Other people are very much quality of life driven, not instead of the economy, but as well as and indeed with and for a better economy that benefits everyone because of that. So to begin with, then, there are leadership questions, and we convene in my group that I help bring together called what's now the ARC Education Project. We convene a group of 8 ministers and their countries who believe in these values, these humanitarian values that I've set out here. This is what binds them for an annual summit. And indeed, they're meeting about every 6 weeks online during coronavirus to share their practices and their approaches. They include Nicola Sturgeon of Scotland, her minister John Swinney. They include Kirsty Williams of Wales. And these are ministries during the coronavirus crisis who we've seen represent the best of leadership at this time, which is empathetic, which is collaborative and involves all stakeholders, including teacher unions, is decisive, and is evidence informed, not evidence driven, because even the public health advice is contradictory sometimes, but take the best judgments they can on the basis of the evidence there together. And once they decide, then everybody is with them in the way they move forward, as opposed to, say, the education minister for England, whose leadership in everything, including going back to schools, has been insipid, inconsistent, and ineffective. First of all, not being able to decide whether people should go back to school or not, and then compelling everybody to go back to school, irrespective of their circumstances, and not mindful of the kinds of conditions that going back to school will mean. So the first thing is, when we deal with this crisis at every level and moving beyond it, leadership at every level truly matters. The societal level, the community level, the school level, the classroom level. All these are leaders, your leaders, all of you as well. So leadership is really an absolutely key factor here. Then, just hold on one second, I have to move over to watch something else here. So the question is, this is a picture I took last year actually in South Korea. And I just want to mention South Korea briefly because it represents everything I've just described about the effectiveness of a country's response to the health crisis and also to the education crisis within it. So South Korean leadership was very collaborative. It involved everybody in making a decision. It was informed by the evidence. It tested early and extensively. It uses masks pervasively. It took children out of school when it needed to, and everybody agreed on the direction. Every school had a teacher representative who became part of a national network to deliver online learning to children in schools. That is largely a public network with some private partners. And so in Korea, over 99% of families and young people have devices. and have internet access. So technology is not in a digital divide. It is universal, it is public, more or less, and it is or affordable, and it is free to everybody. So the way they work with teachers and schools reflects the way they worked as a society as well. So if we look at this post-pandemic future, what exactly might it be like? And I want to set out two scenarios for you. First is, if you look at what transnational organizations are saying, these are like the big global economic organizations, and also many governments, the big technology companies, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, and so on, Bill Gates. This is that they are together. There's kind of an amalgam of what is looking like, one name for it is reimagining education. Now, reimagining education, how could you be against reimagining education? But there's a particular way in which this is being constructed across a range of documents and reports that are coming through now. And it consists of these kinds of elements, and I'll move back and forth slightly on the PowerPoint as I go through these. One is the idea that austerity is inevitable, and yet people like Kate Rayworth, Mariana Mazzucato, Joe Stiglitz, the US former Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich, all say austerity is not inevitable, that actually investment at this time is more important than cutting back. I'll talk about that in a minute. They tend to put Bloom before Maslow. So if you've done your teacher education, you'll know about Bloom's taxonomy of curriculum objectives. And Maslow is about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is more about well-being and human development. So in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we think of things like a shelter, food security, emotional security. These are at the base of Maslow's needs. In this first scenario, though, you'll find most of the talk is about learning and a bit about the physical health of the children, but not a lot about the emotional health of the children beyond the pandemic, not just during the pandemic, but indeed beyond the pandemic when children return to school. Then you'll see a lot in the next two boxes about the role about technology as the answer to what will be beyond the coronavirus crisis. You'll hear talk about hybrid learning, blended learning, public-private partnerships between governments and technology companies. You'll hear about learning being ubiquitous, learning being anytime, anywhere, learning not needing a building, learning taking place at home if you want it, or in other locations. And this sounds terrific at one level, but it misses out two things. One is the downsides of technology. So we know, for example, that since about 2012, as Jean Twenge has pointed out in a brilliant book, iGen, based on a long-term quantitative research of adolescent engagement, life, and satisfaction, that in about 2012, something spectacular happened to the emotional life of adolescents, and rates of mental health problems, anxiety, depression started to skyrocket. And what this coincided with was the iPhone and the mass access to adolescents across the world of the iPhone. So Jean Twenge tells us, paradoxically, teenagers are more safe physically in face-to-face contact with each other. There's less alcohol, less early pregnancy, less physical violence, but they are more unsafe psychologically because they're on Instagram late into the night, checking on how they look, how they appear, and what other people think about them, rather than doing other things, rather than going to sleep, rather than engaging in other activities with their friends. Young people already spend enormous amounts of time on screens. And so the question is how much time should they be spending and in what ways on screens? after the coronavirus crisis. And will learning anywhere, anytime, hybrid, blended, some of which we'll need, as will talk about shortly, actually exacerbate these problems. So what I'd really like to hear from the technology companies, from the proponents of reimagining education, is what some of the downsides of technology will be and how we will mitigate those and how we will take care of them, not eliminating technology, but thinking about avoiding harm through technology as well as doing good. And you know, when you're on technology, there was a great piece just this week in The Guardian about 2 days ago by a journalist who's also a mother about how for 2 weeks she thought she was the genius of learning online for a young child. And then it just got too much while she was also trying to work from home. So she set them up with, you know, videos and things like this that could occupy them. And eventually they discovered TikTok. And she thought, well, TikTok's not so harmful. You just see pictures of kids doing like crazy things and dancing and so on. But before she knew it, her kids were talking about how lame everything was and telling each other what a fat ass they'd got because they were picking up all the language, if you like, the rude side of TikTok as well. So I think what we've discovered during coronavirus is uh, parents in general who already have jobs make very poor uncertified substitute teachers. That they are the parents of their children, but they're not certified teachers. And technology is not a good substitute either when few kids have devices or where there are 4 kids in a family all needing to be in technology at the same time who can't be easily supervised, when kids have ADHD. So many special ed kids at home are finding great difficulty with using technology and maintaining a focus. So in a way, it's quite bizarre that during this time when technology has in many ways had to be an answer, and many teachers have learned very quickly, it's also been a huge problem in families. So it's quite ironic that technology and hybrid learning is being pushed as the magic solution as to what will be on the other side of the crisis. Many teachers actually are already using technology. The OECD data shows in most countries about 60 to 70% of teachers already use technology as part of their teaching and learning in ways that support and enhance their teaching and learning. So we're not starting from zero. Teachers already have the capacity and they know best how to do that, and also how to support children in these other areas when they're not on technology, like playing outside, which is what Denmark and the Nordic countries have focused on a lot, while children have been going back to school, for example, with social distancing. So just to take you back again to where we were before, we need to look at technology as a mixed blessing and not as a magic answer. And I'm not going to talk about the teaching side. I can get into that later. But in general, there's a kind of narrative to offer teachers over 55 early retirement who are vulnerable and needn't go back. And that seems compassionate, although some teachers at 55 are in the prime of their careers. And so to nudge them into early retirement, if you're in, say, an academy chain or something like that, may not actually be best either for their well-being or for the children's well-being. And last also, there is a lot of evidence during coronavirus that the one thing nobody's missed is high stakes testing. They've not missed their examinations. They've not missed the SATs, the SATs in England. They've not missed the high stakes tests in America and in Canada. They miss their teachers. They miss their friends. They've missed learning, but nobody's really missed the testing. And testing costs a lot of money. And so when we're coming back beyond coronavirus, one place we can save money is by abolishing the high stakes tests. And indeed, we found during Hurricane Katrina and during the Christchurch earthquake, when many children had to stay at home for many weeks. The evidence afterwards was that actually children's achievement improved after many weeks at home, not deteriorated. And the main reason people think is twofold. One is nobody was rushing the children through the curriculum to get them to where they had to be by the end of the year. And secondly, a lot of time they missed was time when they would be revising for tests and examinations. They wouldn't be learning something new, but they were simply mugging up what they already knew for the purpose of a test. So we can really rethink testing. We can rethink the value of it, and we can rethink the cost of it. And the state of Oregon, for example, in America, is moving all its testing budget from high stakes tests to formative assessment that will help, using technology as well, give students continuous feedback on what it is they're doing and give the teachers continuous information about how the kids are progressing. So, are you with me so far? Wave if you are, or if I'm talking to a void. All right, good. Thank you, Ruby. So next, what's the opposite of this? Well, the opposite of this is these things. First, instead of austerity, we can have prosperity. This isn't wealth. This isn't financial gain. The original Latin meaning of prosperity is simply living well. Instead of austerity that we know after the 2008 economic financial crisis actually had awful impacts on the poor, on local authorities and communities within places like the UK. We can have prosperity, we can have investment. And if we invest, this is the only plug I'll make for my new book, which is called Moving, a Memoir of Education and Social Mobility, about growing up in a working class family in the north of England. We know that when you invest in public services, right now it does three jobs. One is it enables children to go back to school because you're investing in the schools. It enables people to go back to work by letting the children go back to school. Secondly, if you invest in public services, it creates jobs. It helps build your way out of austerity by creating lots of extra jobs and kickstarting the economy. And third, we know that societies that have strong governments, big governments, not weak governments instead of strong markets, are societies where there is more social mobility. So that if you come from an immigrant family or a working class home, and your first middle class job is in the government sector because there are lots of middle class jobs there. There's no nepotism. There's nobody trying to do you a favor. There's nobody trying to give you an in to a banking company or a not-for-profit foundation, but rather you get your first job on your merits. So big governments, strong governments, create more upward mobility, which is why places like Canada and the Nordic countries have high mobility, and places like the UK and the US have low mobility because they've cut back on government and on government services. So this is why prosperity is actually important at this particular time, not just now, but in general. Secondly, it's about putting Maslow before Bloom. It's about what we've learned during the coronavirus crisis is even more important than learning loss is just people's well-being. The group that has been most vulnerable for mental health problems during coronavirus is not old people like me. Mainly we are fine unless we're in a care home, by the way. And it's not very young children either, but it's teenagers. Why? Because the purpose of school for teenagers is partly learning, but it's also that critical time in their life where they want to know how they get on with their friends. They want to know if they're valued by other people. They're developing a sense of who they are within the world and within the society, what their purpose, what their mission, what their values are. They're developing a sense of identity in general, but also what it means to be LGBT, what it means to be immigrant, what it means to be indigenous, what it means to be black, what it means to live in a diverse society. That this is a key part of what education is about. It's not just about learning, but it is about teachers helping young people develop a sense of who they are, what they belong to, what they're part of, and how they can make it better. So Maslow comes before Bloom, and a bit lower down, more important than any time, anywhere right now, is the here and now. How we make the here and now better as children go back to school during this transition phase of social distancing, but also in general. How we support, how we invest more counselors, more special education support, more volunteers to work alongside young people and help them through this global simultaneous epidemic of mental health problems that we've seen accelerating within about the last 8 to 10 years, almost all around the world because of technology, because of the greatest refugee crisis for 50 years, where many young people who come into our schools have multiple experiences of post-traumatic stress, their village being burned down, their relatives being killed, forcibly removed from their homes, abused, tortured, uh, and then they arrive in our schools. And so our children's needs are becoming more intense, and we need more investment in the here and now, not moving a lot of that here and now into digital, online, flexible, anywhere, anytime kind of learning. But the paradox of this is at the same time as we need to really strengthen the here and now for young people in school and their teachers. And this, by the way, is so important for teachers too, because research in many organizations that I've seen, one is the Alberta Teachers Association, is showing how much teachers are doing the best right now, but really miss that face-to-face contact with young people. The biggest psychic rewards of teaching are seeing the light bulb go on in a child's face when they get something for the first time, when they can read their first word, when they become confident as a reader and not just technically able to string a few words together, when they share something personal and confidential, which might be happy or it might be sad, like the loss of a pet with you, when you realize that you're one of the few adults who cares for them as well as their parents. And they realize that. And sometimes actually instead of their parents. This is what child protection and childcare and the enormous value of our schools is. And this is take that away for teachers. And as one teacher recently said to me, what's online learning like? It's teaching with all the fun taken out. And so we need to really, the here and now is the center of gravity. Hybrid online can help and enhance that. It can make good teachers better, but hybrid online learning will not make a bad teacher or a teacher who's just starting into a great teacher. Having a passion for teaching, inspiring your children, surprising them, helping them to work together, giving them boundaries, rules so they know how to listen, know how to line up, know what it means to not be racist or prejudiced, even though their parents might be. These are some of the essentials of what teaching is about that cannot be done online. So the here and now is the center of gravity, and the online and the hybrid can enrich and extend that, but absolutely not replace it. Last that I want to talk about, and then I'll stop, is that this is really a chance to rethink our relationship to testing, to the SATs in England, and to their equivalent in lots of other places. I've done a lot of work on this in Ontario, where we have had testing for 20 years in grades 3, years 3, 6, and 9. And even though there are no punitive consequences like closing down schools or firing the head teacher, the results are published, and they put enormous pressure on schools to just get their results up almost at any price. I'm just taking you through all these slides so that. So first of all, one of the things we know, this is the OECD's last PISA report on the international PISA results in 2019. The OECD also collects data on quality of life satisfaction. And if you look at this chart here, you'll see as you go higher up, average life satisfaction of 15-year-olds improves. And as you move from left to right, student achievement increases. The most worrying cell here is the bottom right-hand cell. And there you find that actually a group of nations with high achievement scores and low quality of life scores. And many people believe this is not just a coincidence, but in countries like those in Southeast Asia, where there's enormous pressure on academic achievement, it leads to profoundly negative consequences. In Japan, they talk about students having an escape from learning once they've finished school because they're so sick of learning and test-based learning, so that when they go to university, they don't want to do any learning at all, and they just kind of coast along as a result. In South Korea, there are huge incidences of adolescent suicide for many reasons, but one is the enormous pressure of the tests to get into the top three, what are called the SKY universities. So there's an inverse relationship between high test scores and student well-being. We studied this in Ontario, where we found that actually testing creates ill-being in young children. We found that it leads to everything we know: narrowing of the curriculum, teaching to the test, focusing on kids who are near the cutoff point for the test score, so a bit of effort with them, say to get a grade C in the GCSEs in England, is disproportionately assigned at the cost of children who are really struggling lower down. Cultural bias with items that are difficult for poor kids to empathize with, or for indigenous kids to empathize with. And also just immense anxiety amongst the kids, kids who have to take the test when they've only just arrived in the country, can barely speak English or French in Canada. Kids who've got post-traumatic stress or a range of special educational needs. And the teachers feel under enormous duress about whether they put the kids in for the test or whether they excuse the kids from the tests, and those kids then get a 0 and put the performance and the reputation of the school down. So the evidence is now overwhelming that SATs and other kinds of standardized tests have systemic negative consequences for student learning and well-being. Nobody's missed the tests. We're going back. We're going to need a lot of money when we go back. One place we can save that is on a testing system that destroys learning and diminishes well-being, and invest it in an assessment system that improves learning and enhances well-being. So to close, this is what Confucius said. I've modified it slightly to say people rather than men, because he did live in a far distant time and culture from now. But the superior person at this time, as we move forward, the superior person understands what is right. The inferior person understands what will sell. What will sell is big tech. What will sell is austerity that cuts back on public expenditure of more tech, more hybrid, more blended, more learning anywhere, anytime, and continuing testing as part of one scenario. That's what will sell. What is right is prosperity, is investment, is technology that is there for everyone within the school, but is not the driver. And technology at home paradoxically, that is universal, public and free, like it is in Uruguay or in Korea, are not at the whims of the market in terms of who it is available. So here and now in school, with some tech, universal public tech everywhere else, and in a system that will pay attention to the well-being of young children, all young people, and their learning, and will use an assessment system that supports that and not a testing system that undermines it. There's a big narrative that will want to take you down the first path rather than the second path. It's going to be up to people like you, to the profession, to the researchers, to professionals, and to many people in our communities to fight robustly for an alternative narrative that some governments in the world, mainly led by women, support, that will enhance and build the quality of life for everyone and not promote the technological profits of a very wealthy few.